Good afternoon, and welcome to Managing Insider Threats in an Era of Remote Workers and Increased Turnover, a Health System CIO Media Inc. production sponsored by Protenus. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Health Systems CIO, and I'll be your moderator today. We're looking forward to your participation. You can send in your questions or comments at any time in the Q&A box, and we will take them later in the program. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, first we're going to go about 35 to 40 minutes with our main panel discussion featuring Paul Carrillo, CISO at Inova Health System, Nate Lesser, VP and CISO at National Children's Hospital, and Nick Culbertson, co-founder and CEO at Protenus. And then we will have our Q&A. So let's jump right in. Great topic today. Lots to talk about. Paul, let's start with you. Can you give us an overview of your organization and your role?
Yeah, so here at Inova, we are a major health system in Northern Virginia with 5 hospitals throughout the area. My role as CISO is largely focused on information assurance and cyber threat hunting and threat protection. We see a lot of activity in this space. All of us have seen a lot of activity in this space. So there's a lot that keeps us up at night, keeps us very busy during the day.
All right, very good, Paul. Thank you. Nate?
Sure. My name's Nate Lesser. I'm the CISO at Children's National Hospital. It's Children's National, not National Children's. And I always say that only because we don't want to get confused with Nationwide Children's, which is another top children's hospital in the country. Children's National is a top 5 pediatric healthcare system. We've got about 60 sites in and around the DC area. And I've been at Children's now for a little over 3 years, and like Paul, as the CISO here, my responsibilities are somewhat wide-ranging and cover anything information security related, including obviously operational risk management, identity and access management, and the teams that implement all of those capabilities. We are constantly focused on the rising threat, both inside and outside of the hospital. Just today, another children's hospital, unfortunately, it appears went down pretty hard. I guess it started yesterday in Chicago. So it's not that we are exempt or unfortunately in any way immune from the attacks of those looking to exploit the digital environments that we have. Children's hospitals are often seen as a soft target, and hospitals where we have a lot of the most sensitive and valuable information. So we deal with the same kind of advanced nation state threats, and of course all the standard commoditized threats that everybody else is dealing with across the environment.
Well, Nate, thanks for bringing that up. So anybody who might be under the illusion that the bad guys would stay away from children's hospitals would be mistaken, correct?
Yeah, unfortunately so.
Unbelievable. All right, very good. Nick?
Hey everyone, Nick Culbertson, CEO and co-founder of Protenus. We use AI to help automate hospital compliance workflows. Specifically, we focus on 2 areas. We use AI to monitor activities and health data to identify privacy violations and other insider threats. We also assess activity using narcotics and other sensitive pharmaceuticals to proactively detect and prevent drug diversion or theft of drugs.
Excellent. Thank you, Nick. All right, let's jump right into the meat of it. How would you describe the fluidity of the workforce today versus pre-pandemic? Paul, we're going to start with you.
Sure. So during the pandemic, we had the rush to remote access, sending everybody home and trying to figure out our way through that. Post pandemic, things are beginning to normalize. We've gotten comfortable with that arrangement, and now we're seeing some flow back to the office, but it's still quite a mix. There's probably probably for the foreseeable future, going to be more hybrid or remote work in the workforce, because now we've realized that we can actually do that. So I think that's one dynamic. The other is that with work from home, we tend to hire more outside of the area, and folks feel more comfortable with looking beyond the horizons for employment. So that kind of changes the dynamic as far as who's available for the workforce in any particular area. So that's something that I can't say it's new anymore, but that's something that we've had to deal with here in the last year and a half.
Okay, very good. We'll get into the implications of that. Nate, how would you describe the fluidity of the workforce today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's some important drivers, especially when you think about there's workforce writ large, and then there's workforce when it comes to information security. I am not, my background prior to this was not in healthcare, and so I'm much more of sort of a horizontal guy, cybersecurity across lots of different fields and different verticals. So I was surprised coming into a healthcare system to learn the extent to which back office functions, we all think of hospitals as, it's an in-person function. Care delivery is an in-person function. It has to be. But even in the world where there's a move to telehealth, but I was surprised by the extent to which it's challenging for healthcare systems to get around the regulatory and compliance requirements, which is really a cultural change, right? It's really about saying, oh, we can split our workforce. These are jobs and functions that don't have to be performed on site. It's really new. It's different, and it's not the same in healthcare as it would be in financial services or technology. So that's one component of it that still, I think, certainly we're experiencing the continuation of that cultural change and a pivot to the idea that we can hire folks that might be in places where the cost of living is lower, and therefore have an opportunity to spend less for the same high quality skill set. At the same time, from a cybersecurity perspective, we have just all kinds of headwinds, right? We're a little bit off of the all-time high of supply, the supply demand ratio for cybersecurity talent, but it's still incredibly high. Today it sits at 72%, according to NICE, the National Institute Standards and Technology program for cyber education. And that means that 72% of the cybersecurity jobs are filled. We've got just shy of 1.2 million cybersecurity professionals in the country, and we have slightly under 600,000 cybersecurity job openings. That's a huge delta, and it's not one that's going to be filled easily or quickly. So we have to look for more creative solutions to staffing, and ways to find force multipliers in order to cost effectively meet the continually rising needs that we have.
Very good, Nate. Nick, your thoughts on what you're seeing with your customers regarding the fluidity of the workforce?
So I think about the dynamics and turnover in three different levels in healthcare. The first is, I think, the most obvious, just the high volume of turnover we've seen since the pandemic. We talk about this a lot generally in the industry, but I don't think everyone really appreciates how large and how significant the turnover has been. We saw with some of our customers as much as 50% in a year, where they have an entire new half of the health system. And so all of the compliance and cultural implications that Nate was talking about, I think, are spot on. The second is leadership. We've seen a lot of leadership turnover in the past 3 or 4 years. And I think that has implications for strategy, planning, and delay of a lot of initiatives as new leadership takes a step in and takes the time to get assessment of the organization and really get up and running. And then the last, I think, is relevant to companies like mine, but hitting vendors. We've dealt with companies where we've had longer support tickets or other times support documentation because new individuals are turning over vendors, and it makes it more difficult to work through those partnerships. And so I think the combination of all three of those is really what is making this this labor market pretty dynamic and difficult for hospital systems.
All right, very good. Next question. Nate, we're going to start with you. Talk about the relationship between staff turnover and security, especially insider threats. What are the best ways to ensure IT security is notified in a timely manner when people are hired, fired, or have a change in their role that requires a change in their access? And you get into identity and access management and all that type of thing, making sure the permissions are correct. And besides HR, are there any other departments that you need to be working with as a security professional to make sure you are informed when things change that would require you to do something?
Sure. So I mean, I think like a lot of challenges, it's multifaceted, and we have to look at it from the perspective of technology, policy, governance. I guess I would start with the first question, the last question first, and say, of course, right? You have to work with all departments across your environment. Obviously, HR is critical, and if in any environment where we could design it from the ground up, you know, a pristine environment that did not come with any legacy technology or policy debt, we would say, oh, well, you know, there's a standard HR process for offboarding. Everybody applies it consistently, and we have a single identity store and the complete integration between our ERP system, our identity and access management systems, and then all downstream applications. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Right. Unfortunately, healthcare, like just about every other, you know, vertical, but I would say care delivery especially is such an organic growth of digital technology being bolted onto traditional solutions for, you know, the combination of care delivery, point of care, and everything from, you know, charting to financials and back office and rev cycle and everything else under the sun. So we find ourselves, and you'll see this in systems of varying sizes, but the larger you get, the more likely you are to be in an incredibly diverse technology environment, and you have to start driving towards standardization. The problem is it's very expensive to do so, right? So if you've grown through acquisition, let's say, and brought in a lot of, you know, outpatient centers or a couple of additional hospitals all under one system, you'll find that the cost associated with getting everybody on the same ERP is off the charts. But until you have a single identity store where you can, you know, drive trust out of that environment, until you have everybody adhering to a single policy for moves and changes for you know, leavers for people who are terminated from your environment, it's going to be very difficult to get your hands around this. So I would say it's very much about working with every department and outside of HRs and IT certainly. What are the best ways to do it? Even in the absence of an expensive and kind of brand new ERP system or integration, there's a lot that you can do from a policy and education perspective, and that's really about cultural change, right? That's about communication and ensuring that you're out in the environment. So if you're like us, a teaching hospital, in addition to being a research center, you're going to have different people in the credentialing space that you have to deal with. And prior to the onboarding or offboarding of a care provider, they're going to have to review and submit credentialing paperwork, and that's going to be integrated into your system. You have to understand where those checks are and ensure that the systems are either integrated or you have a very tightly coupled process for offline application and removal of entitlements for staff that leave. So it's real tough, but it can be done. It can be done well, even in the absence of an expensive and costly set of technical integrations.
Excellent. Thank you, Nate. Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to pivot on one aspect that Nate brought up, and that's the diverse nature of the populations that make up the workforce within healthcare. Many of us will have good, solid processes, whether automated or manual, dealing with the employed workforce, team members, associates, whatever label we use for that, but the employed workforce. But that's not the total workforce. We have partners, we have consultants, we have contractors, we have auditors, we have other various populations. They all need access. And the identity for those don't all come through the main ERP. We'd love it if they would, but a lot of times that's not feasible. So best way really to get a handle on that is to identify and understand who all the stakeholders are for each of those populations, and just start with a conversation around how do we know that these are the identities we want in our system? How do we know that? And certainly work towards that. Many of us in healthcare have done that to some degree, I'm sure, but that probably varies with the available time you have to concentrate on that particular problem. But if we don't understand the identities coming into our environment, it's going to be really hard for us to understand later when we're dealing with an event whether or not that population or somebody within that population should have had access in the first place. One of the, I'll just emphasize that one of the best ways to get a handle on that is to communicate, is to seek out those stakeholders and document along the path. What you end up with might be an automation system, maybe it might be a manual process, but that's certainly a starting point. With respect to that, it's also important for us to understand what we're going to do in the face of degraded or unavailable systems. When we start talking about identity management and access, or giving access to people so that they can do the important work of healthcare within our environments, we need to be thinking about business continuity along those lines as well. What do we do when the process begins to falter? Some key component isn't available. We can't forget that as we're working our way through that piece. How do we ensure the right parties are informed on changes to workforce? That's a really good question. For us, it's certainly HR, and it's also physical security, the badging system, and then of course each of the departments that are affected by the hiring, transfer, and termination of employees. It starts with that communication, though. I mean, we really it just have to get right back to making sure that we're a known quantity in that conversation, and that we know all the other stakeholders. Because without that, we're still shooting in the dark.
Excellent, Paul. Thank you. Nick, your thoughts?
Paul and Nate have both covered a lot of ground on this topic, but I think the only thing I would add is not the relationship within a department, but more generally the relationship with middle management across the organization. Excuse me, my dog is barking. But the result of turnover for management means that there's a higher burden on training new staff, which is can suck away time from other standard operations, especially if you don't have the same senior leadership that managers usually rely on. I was talking to a customer recently that said they had 100% turnover month to month for some of their analysts on a team. And so when you're constantly retraining the same role month over month, that's a large amount of your time that's pulled away from standard operations to make sure that your team is fully up to speed and fully compliant.
Yes, turnover can drain a lot of positive energy into places that it might not need to go. Next question, Nick, we're going to stick with you. Talk about the relationship between remote workers especially those who may be hired in a fully remote capacity and insider threats. The idea here is, in the past, the onboarding process always involved face-to-face time, time in the office, time to absorb the culture of the organization, more chances for sort of molding the individual. And if you've hired someone that you perhaps have never met in person, you may not know them as well. I'm sure there's background checks and things that can be done, but I wonder if it's not inevitable that there's some sort of increased risk from the concept of hiring somebody fully remotely and never having that time together. What are your thoughts there, Nick?
I think there's a lot of advantages that remote work provides, but the reality is remote work just adds another layer of complexity for this issue, especially from an insider threat perspective. And I mean that from everything from monitoring individual traffic, IP addresses, straight out to really understanding who your workforce is. There's been lots of anecdotes of people doing multiple jobs or offshoring their own jobs. And the fact that you can't see that person come into the office every day creates a lot of risk for organizations from that insider threat perspective.
Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that the standoff engagement here is what makes this harder for companies. There is a tendency, human nature being what it is, a tendency to assume trust in communications that we should perhaps challenge, and here more so than in any other situation. In the traditional sense, you typically have to go into the HR department with your two picture IDs and proof of employment, employability, get a picture taken, and then you're off to your job. Well, that's really changed here in the last few years. And the use of technology is kind of a stand-in for that, and creates the risk that we assume trust and we fail to verify. And that's usually where we start having problems in these traditional processes. I lean towards having at least one on-site visit to confirm identities and have that engagement. It shouldn't be that terribly expensive. Sure, there's a plane ticket and a hotel and that piece, but that should be incorporated into the enculturation into the organization, I think. And that's something that we sort of do here. We don't do that too broadly because it's kind of hard. We're talking about when we hire nurses, we're hiring a lot of nurses. So we have turnover there, so that makes it rather difficult. So there is some risk in hiring somebody who isn't who they say they are, and we don't find out about it until later. It becomes something that we have to handle. Finding other ways to get that positive identification through technology, I think is possible. But again, we need to review the technology that we intend to use to do that. And for instance, we might say, well, we'll use certificates and we'll have this MFA kind of thing. And because all that stuff is there, we can assume again that the process can't be subverted. Well, we don't know that unless we actually look at the process and analyze it. So that's something I think we need to challenge ourselves with and make sure that we understand how sure that process really is, especially for those that are never going to be on site in the first place.
Very good. Nate, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I guess I agree with everything that both Nick and Paul said. I come to a slightly different conclusion, and it's probably a bit of a contrarian one, but I don't think I would ever hire someone who without having at least some cadence, even if it's only annually, of getting together in person. That said, we consider those people to be, full-time remote workers. And one of the things that we're forced to do, and this is exactly what Paul, I think, was saying, is ratchet up other controls to ensure that over the life cycle of someone's employment, we are, in fact, ensuring that they're managed properly, that they're getting resources that they need, and that they're doing the work that we're expecting of them. and I think the management challenges there are unique and different and varied. However, from an insider threat perspective, I think as we've all seen, someone can be working on site in the hospital and be a intentional, fraudulent, or destructive insider. Someone can be working from home and be the same. What I think helps in the hybrid world that we live in today is that we're all very much, I think, much more conscious of both intentional and unintentional insiders. And in a hybrid environment, we're looking for the controls that help us to get a better handle on potential fraudulent activity, whether intentional from that user or unintentional, that person got duped and there's somebody taking over their accounts or doing something fraudulent with their credentials. And that results, I think, in us being stronger overall. So, we could, it used to be, I think we were lulled into a little bit of a false sense of security around the idea that if I can look at somebody, I know what's going on in their head, or if I can see them, they're working inside the four walls of our building, and therefore they're likely more secure. Turns out in the digital world, that's just not true. We know that now. And so we should be constantly looking for the controls that help us to secure our staff and the systems they touch, regardless of where they're working from.
Very good. Very good. All right. Next question. Paul, we're going to start with you. And we touched on this idea of sort of multifaceted approach. Many think the threat of insider breaches is higher than ever. What are some best practices for preventing and discovering these? And again, touch on the multi-pronged approach of technology, education, and governance. I think you could substitute policies for either education or governance, or maybe that's a fourth. I don't know. What are your thoughts there, Paul?
Yeah, I see all of those areas as kind of tools in a way of addressing this, but this really boils down to management style and engagement. Maybe under the education component here, but ensuring that managers and leaders within the workforce are aware and have been provided sufficient tools to understand and respond to situations that could be insider threats and know who to engage, and not be afraid to do that engagement. Certainly having a robust compliance capability to help respond on that is going to be necessary. And by robust, I don't mean a large workforce. I mean dedicated and knowledgeable folks who can help guide management in identifying the indications and warnings that lead to insider threat activity. As far as the technology piece is concerned, certainly having the tools in place like Protenus, looking at situations that could be precursors to fraud or precursors to insider threat behaviors, and then having folks respond to those indications. And that's an actually really important point here, because a lot of times people will put a tool in and it's okay, we got a tool running, it will take care of the house for us. That's not true. We actually need to spend time understanding the information that technology is producing in order to understand whether or not we have such a situation and need to deal with it. The last piece here, the governance piece, it's important that the workforce understand the organization's position with respect to insider threat, and maybe not even calling it out as just insider threat, that has a kind of a big brother feel to it, but rather ensure that folks understand that we hired you to do a job, and we really want you to be successful in that job, and we expect you to be engaged in that job. And that if for some reason there's a problem there, that we would like that engagement rather than have that turn into a situation, an adverse situation that results in harm to the organization, harm to individuals. So that would be the kind of the discovering and preventing aspects, I think, of dealing with insider threats. And that's not the end all be all, but I think that would be a good starting point.
Very good, Nate.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with what Paul said. I think it's helpful. There's some models out there on what we sometimes call human risk management. To just pick up on the last thing Paul was talking about around, insider threats a little can be a little narrow. And frankly, most of the time, I think what we're care about is visibility, right? How do we know what's happening? Whether that is somebody intentionally or unintentionally doing something they shouldn't, sort of outside of the bounds of their their job or the controls, access controls that we have in place. And a piece of that is really, I think, best communicated to staff around how do we help as the information security professionals in your organization, how do we help protect you? How do we help protect your accounts? How do we help to ensure that the threats that you're facing aren't going to be successful? And that's a partnership. That's a lot of that is education, and a lot of it is about the technology that gives us visibility into the digital activity in their environment. And I think that's where you are able to sometimes bridge the gap from what feels a little Big Brother-esque to thinking about it much more in terms of just like my home security system. Um, so I think that partnership is critical, and that's what I would focus on.
Very good, Nick. Oh, you're on mute, buddy.
I apologize. My dog's been barking a lot, so I tried to save you guys the noise. I didn't mean to do that.
No worries.
I want to reiterate the idea about trust and verify and how important it is to be proactively monitoring and enforcing policies at scale. Not because we think that there is a lot of people in our organizations that are creating risk, but the reality is it's very difficult to identify the few people that are creating that risk. When you have a large organization, you have so much activity. It's very difficult to proactively identify those hotspots and make sure you're focusing on those risk mitigations. The other thing that I wanted to add is a little bit about along the lines of the broken window policies. We know that some of the most egregious insider incidents don't just come out of nowhere. They build up over time, and monitoring and addressing minor risk and the small stuff that builds up is really important to be proactive in both the catching it before it gets too worse, but also using it as an opportunity to educate. We see a lot of the times where individuals are caught going beyond their scope or using data beyond their provisions, and usually their answer is, "Oh, I didn't know that. I wasn't aware," even though they took the new employee training. But being able to come back and use that example to educate right there and say, no, this is against our policy. You're not supposed to be doing that. That has such an impact on reducing the overall risk landscape, because left unchecked, those individuals would continue to build up that behavior and push the limits. And that's where you get some of the more egregious incidents that build up over time.
Nick, let's talk a little bit about policy, and then we'll bring in Nate and Paul. I've interviewed a lot of CISOs, and we talk about policies. One issue is that the policies have to be written so they're understandable by non-security professionals, non-IT professionals, who are really the main target of the policies. Well, not one of the main targets. So you can have policies that are written in too complex a way, they're not understandable, and they could be kind of useless. So people are trying to make sure that doesn't happen. And the other thing is communicating the policy, right? So you don't ideally want to be in a situation where somebody says, "I had no idea," right? You want to be able to demonstrate, no, number one, we have a very readable policy. And number two, we know you looked at it because you had to, because we have the audit trail that says you received this education. So talk a little bit about policies.
I think the key, I agree everything you said, that it has to be something that's clear and easy to understand. It has to be something that you can educate. But I think the most important is that they have to be enforceable. I think a really good example of this, and this is outside of healthcare, but when you look back at a lot of the nuclear disarmament work that happened in the in the 1900s, we could detect nuclear bombs that were occurring underground or in the water, but or I'm sorry, we could detect them in the air or underwater, but you can't detect them if they're underground. And if you can't detect them, then you can't enforce a policy. And I think a lot of compliance policies in healthcare are the same way, that if you're asking someone not to do it, but you're not monitoring or not identifying it, and you don't have a response on how to handle it if you do find it, then it's not really a policy because it's not enforced. And so I think the key is to be able to map your policies to procedures, and that it involves a lot of partnership and really understanding, okay, if someone does do this, what are the ramifications? What are the sanctions? How are we going to deal with it? And how are we going to include folks like HR and others to make sure that we're being very equitable in our handling of breaches of compliance as well.
That's great stuff, Nick. And I'd like to let me bring in Nate first. This concept of policies have to map to procedures. So, here's what you're supposed to be doing. We can tell when this wasn't done, and here's what's going to happen if it wasn't done.
Yeah, so I think Nick makes a fantastic point. And I would just say it's true at the macro level and it's true at the micro level. I think visibility is essential from a technology perspective to be able to, see what's happening in your environment. But if you don't have that visibility in place, and if you don't have the procedural controls to be able to enforce policy, what you end up doing actually is only punishing those people who are the good actors. The only time you'll ever hear about it is when someone calls and says, I think I screwed up. And then all of a sudden you say, oh, okay, well, you can't do that. And you make their life harder rather than approaching it from you can have policies in place that aren't consistently enforced. It's a bad idea, but you can do it. And if you do it that way, when you hear about in a kind of ad hoc fashion, somebody violating policy because they have come to you to let you know that, you have to find a way to reward them rather than punish them, right? You have to completely flip the equation on its head. And so I would agree, those aren't really enforced policies. Those are just out there as aspirational goals.
Paul?
Yeah, I would, excellent, well said. And I would add to that the expectations need to be enculturated into the workforce. And what I mean by that is setting the tone from the top down that we expect a certain type of behavior even when no one is watching, and that we expect it to be a personal pride point or a point of honor or a point of integrity. So certainly pressing on that in our policy language will help us kind of be proactive, kind of ahead of the curve. But yeah, certainly having the ability to do detection and response is also vitally important, because if you have a rule and you've never enforced the rule, even when you think there's no problem, the first time you enforce that rule, it's going to be challenged, and it's probably going to set a tone in the environment that, if you haven't planned for that, could create, I won't say it's an adverse environment, but an undesirable outcome. So really kind of posturing the policy in a positive tone to drive the behaviors that we're expecting as part of who we are, will help us in that regard, I think.
All right, very good. We got an audience question I want to put in front of the panel. What do you think about technology that reviews employees' productivity, such as login times, number of keystrokes, data entry, number of emails sent? Is this a good means of assessing productivity, or is it just micromanaging? Nick, let's go to you first on this one.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot, especially as a fully remote organization. My personal opinion on this matter is twofold. First, I think it's really important to measure results of employee work, not necessarily their approach, especially as a software development organization. We have a lot more flexibility than care providers that we help service. But if an employee is stepping away from their laptop, but they're still getting the work done, is it a problem? So I think that's important to keep in mind. The other aspect is going back to the point of enforcement. What are you going to do if you find that someone is not typing on the keys as much as you'd like them? And I think having that conversation before you decide whether you want to monitor or not is the more important question.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because keystrokes, somebody could be writing a screenplay and have nothing to do, nothing to do with work. And you say, this is one of our stars. They're fantastic. Having a little fun with that. Nate, your thoughts on that audience question?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think my feeling is it's a terrible way to manage productivity. I mean, it's just you have a lot of examples. I think yours is a good one of, how it just doesn't align with the outcomes you're looking for. At the same time, I think it's very valuable information from an investigation and audit perspective. And I think it's important that, back to policy, you communicate very clearly with staff across your organization. I can't tell you the number of times that I hear from people, what do you mean you have access to my personal tax information when I stored my taxes, my tax return on my corporate device? Well, your corporate device is ours. So anything stored there is ours. And yeah, I'm not saying we're walking around looking for it, but when you leave the organization and come to me and say, I need somebody in IT to download the, 10 gigs of personal family photos onto a flash drive, because that's the only device I've had for the last 20 years. We recognize the world we live in, we try and accommodate, but the reality is, we own your family photos too. And you have to communicate that up front. You have to continue to drive that point home. It's part of our sort of annual and frankly annual training. I think stinks and needs to be thrown out and revised, but we need to keep communicating that very clearly. So I think these are can be useful data points when it comes to audit and investigation, but man, I think they're terrible from a primary management data perspective.
Paul, are you giving back the family photos or are you keeping them?
Well, we've had that conversation at various points. That's easier said than done. Somebody's going to have to review all of that information.
Oh,
Every
wow.
single one of them. It's not very
Exactly.
easy to do. I echo what Nick and Nate have said here. Yes, as soon as we start collecting, that sets a tone too, and we need to be cognizant of what that means to the workforce. Now, if the workforce thinks it's being monitored for any reason at all, their minds are going to run wild on that. So I would say that if you're worried about productivity, it's time to have a direct conversation about that. And the onus is really on the team lead, the manager, the director, the person who is responsible for that portion of the workforce to have that conversation. I think we have a tendency towards, I can implement a tool that's going to collect all this great information on everybody, everywhere. I know all your screenshots, all your keystrokes, everything. Well, first of all, that's a large amount of information, and there's a cost associated with that. Secondly, do you really need to do that? Or do you just need to have a conversation and set the right culture within those teams to ensure that you've got the right engagement? Even in the world of remote workforce. When I conduct meetings, I am almost always on video. Rarely am I not on video. And I encourage my team members to do the same. And they know that. I want to see them. I want to have the interaction with them. And I interact with them all day long. Sometimes it's ad hoc and sometimes it's scheduled. So that level of engagement, management engagement, is necessary if we really want to address productivity. And more importantly, it's about the results. Just as Nick said, it's about the results. It's not about how you got there.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got teams that are producing well, why do you care if they're sitting in front of their laptop or working off their phone at their kid's soccer game or whatever? They're still producing. They're still providing value to the organization.
Yeah, let me just add, I think the times when we've seen it come up, good or bad, are usually from an investigation standpoint. and because Paul and I and anyone in care delivery, anyone in a hospital system has at least a partially unionized workforce, there are times when saying this person isn't getting their job done, when their frontline manager saying that isn't sufficient. They need, material evidence to show they haven't logged in a month and just not shown up remotely or in person. So again, I think it's important to communicate. I think there are times when it's valuable from an investigation and an audit perspective. But I couldn't agree more with Nick and Paul about its sort of lack of value in a standard management environment.
All right, very good. We're going to go to our Ask a Co-Panelist section here, which I love. I want to see what you folks want to know from each other, or the advice, guidance that you would find helpful. So, Nick, do you have a question for one or both of your co-panelists?
I do. This is both for Nate and Paul. We've been talking a lot about staff turnover and the implications of that, but I mentioned this earlier. We see it a lot with the implications with turnover at the executive level and how that affects the organizations. And I know both of you have been in your current roles for a number of years now, but I'm curious whether at your organization or your peers, what have you seen at the executive level as a result of turnover from leadership top down?
Paul, why don't you go first?
What have I seen? There can be some turmoil if not managed correctly or positively. But other than that, I think it's still business as usual as far as the transition process. Yes, you're going to have a new person. The seat's going to be empty for a while. You'll have an interim. You'll have a new person. There's that to consider, but that's really for the business unit to focus in on, and not so much the security side of the house. Yeah, we've not had that much turnover here in the last few years. So we've had a little bit, but not too much. So yeah, I would say those situations we have more hands-on when we go through those transition processes. But other than that, nothing really, pressing comes to mind.
Nate?
Yeah, I guess we've had more leadership turnover in the last year than I think in many years before. And I've seen it, to me, it comes down to communication. I guess two things: communication and preparation, right? So paraphrasing, I don't know who, I'll have to go back and look for this quote. There's a concept that success at an executive level, whether it's the CEO of a business or a business unit owner, is really best measured by the success of that business or business unit when the leader departs, not the success while they're there. So I've seen business units whose leaders left set up for success, where they really have a good succession plan in place, and they're off and running, and largely without significant pain. I've seen others where it's abrupt and surprising to the staff, and all of a sudden there's a lot of scrambling. I'm not sure how to either measure or from a security perspective, what better controls we could put in place. But we often are the first to know that an executive's leaving. Or the second perhaps to know, before it's publicly announced, before we get that call that says at 7:55 tomorrow or 7:55 on Monday, we want access cut off for this executive. It would be great if there were a way for us to kind of ratchet up or down security controls around the rest of the team, so that if there's someone who says, wow, this boss who I loved was just fired, I hate the organization, I'm going to go set the building on fire, we had better visibility, better controls. I don't know how that would work, but that would be pretty cool.
All right, very good. Nate, do you have a question for one or both of your co-panelists?
Yeah, I have a question for Nick. I mean, there were many years where we were talking a lot about user behavioral analytics, like UBA was this big thing, and it was going to be the panacea that would help us to, again, ratchet up or down our controls entirely based on the risk posed by certain individuals or the risk to certain individuals. I feel like I've lost the bubble on it a little bit, and given your place in the industry, I'm curious what you're seeing as the current trends around analytics in terms of extracting good, useful information from the systems that we have.
Yeah, I think it's not talked about as much as a buzzword, but it's still really prevalent in a lot of technologies. Like there's a lot of elements to the Protenus platform that uses end user behavior. I think the important part is what we were talking about earlier in terms of like, what are you measuring? What are you going to do with that information? When we talk to customers about potential new product development, and they always ask, oh, could you detect this or could you detect that? And it's like, the first thing I ask is, what would you do with that information? If I detected when an employee did this, how would you respond? What's the protocol? Because what you don't want to do is just detect things that there's not really a course of action to respond to. And so I think the important question is, not necessarily just focusing on like, oh, UEBA and like, what can it do? But actually, what are the compliance protocols that we want to enforce and how do we detect them? The example that you gave earlier about, you may be monitoring every single activity, but we need to know if someone's coming to work every day. And just look at using their audit log is a really good example. Like, are they logging in every day? And so that's a reactive investigation to confirm and prove some kind of behavior that is necessary as part of an investigation. But then setting up a proactive alerting process that says we're going to fire off an alarm every time someone doesn't show some level of productivity on a day they've checked in. You can imagine how that could create a lot of challenges. And so I think it's still really important, but it really comes down to what behaviors are you trying to detect and how is that feeding into your compliance and what kind of enforcement can you do with it?
All right, very good. Paul, do you have a question for one or both of your co-panelists?
I do, and probably for both. What are some of the biggest challenges you see that organizations face when trying to introduce an insider threat program?
Nick, why don't you go first?
I want to make sure I understood the biggest challenges when trying to put in place an insider threat
Trying to
detection
introduce the
program.
concept of, an insider threat program at an organization.
I would say in our experience working with health systems to build up or either start from scratch or build out a monitoring program, I think one of the more challenging things is getting the right stakeholders involved early. And I'll reinforce a couple points we've made throughout this whole talk, but a lot of situations we've seen occur where if you use a tool like ours, like AI or automation to monitor more activity, you end up finding more activity. That results in downstream work for HR, human resources, or other parts of the organization turnover, where you have to then respond to it. And if those people were not involved in building up the program, they haven't been able to prepare for that cultural change, that culture shift. And so really making sure leadership is all bought in for the change of approach where you are taking a more proactive posture to monitoring and proactively detecting and preventing. You have to make sure you have the right stakeholders in place. Otherwise, what happens is your department changed, but everyone else is trying to catch up.
Great point. Nate?
Yeah, I mean, I can say from our experience, the answer would be scope. I mean, insider threat means all kinds of things to all kinds of people. So I think I agree with Nick that you got to have the right stakeholders at the table, but it's really hard to, or at least we've had some real challenges with scoping a program that allows us to have enough success early on that we can say, yeah, this is worth continuing to do. So I think we're still in the nascent stages of trying to sort through that.
All right, very good. Let's go with a lightning round of final thoughts before I let everyone go. So best piece of advice for someone in your position at a comparably sized health system. Nick, you can adjust that as need be for sort of your maybe middle of the road customer in terms of size. Best piece of advice when trying to deal with this insider threat issue. Paul, let's go with you first.
I would say engagement and communication. Talk often with your peer group, talk often above and below your peer group. Keep the topic fresh without being overbearing. I think that's probably the best advice I can give. As an organization, each organization finds their own path. They figure out the right way to deliver such a program. But it's one that should be talked about. So certainly engagement and communication. And as the CISO, you're probably the it to get it going, unless you've got a chief compliance officer or somebody in that sphere who's just as passionate or more passionate than you are.
Very good, Nate.
I guess I would say hospitals don't generally buy into the truism that the only constant is change. So, I think that at the end of the day, people in our line of work are change agents, right? Cultural change agents. And so you have to balance the goals that you have around change, standardization being a big one of them in my book, with the ability to empower staff, right? We spend a lot of time talking about how our staff are our cyber first responders, but that means they have to have a reasonable amount of training, and you need to provide them with the resources to know what to do when faced with a challenge. That breeds confidence and builds the workforce that you need that extends well beyond those people who report to you.
Excellent. Nick, we'll give you the last word.
I agree with everything Nate said. Paul actually took my answer, so I just want to reinforce it. Education is so important, but engagement is what's really tricky. You can push out a lot of new employee training or annual training to reinforce the workforce what your expectations for them are, but not waiting for something bad to happen to go out to organization and talk with folks, I think is really important. I was just talking to our privacy officer internally about, we did a lot of training in compliance month late in 2023, and now it's what's next. And what she's planning is meeting with the different divisions, different teams, and talk to them about what's the expectation? When should you reach out to me? When should we get engaged? When should we talk to me? So that people, have that little bug in their ear to think like, oh, this is the moment where I should reach out to let security or privacy or compliance know to be involved. And if you don't do that, what ends up happening is you have to then build those relationships in the middle of the disaster. And that's something that I know a lot of folks listening have probably gone through, and something that it's really difficult to build up that muscle memory to avoid over time.
Excellent. All right. That's about all we had time for today. Regarding continuing education, you could use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording of this event is ready for viewing. If you want to sponsor an event with us, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox from our team. Go to our website to register for upcoming panels. With that, I want to thank our tremendous panel. Great conversation today. Paul Carrillo, Nate Lesser, and Nick Culbertson. And I want to thank Protenus for making this conversation possible, and you for attending. And with that, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.